My stepchildren excluded me from their father's will before the funeral flowers had even wilted. They divided the family estate at the dining table, assigned themselves the cars, the paintings, and the guest house, and told me I would be given a reasonable amount for my years of service. Then the estate lawyer walked into the room, looked at the deed in his folder, and asked me one question. "Mrs. Vale, would you like to explain who actually owns the property?" My stepchildren had forgotten one small detail. The family estate was not my husband's to leave. It was mine. My name is Margaret Vale. I was 61 when my husband, Richard, died after 32 years of marriage and 1 year of illness that changed everything inside our family. Richard had 2 children from his first marriage, Clara and Jonathan. They were adults when I met their father, but they were still young enough to need someone who could make dinner, remember school forms, and sit beside them when their mother moved to another state. I never tried to replace their mother. I did not ask them to call me Mom. I did not correct them when they called me Margaret. I simply showed up. I drove Clara to her first college interview in a snowstorm. I helped Jonathan practice for his apprenticeship exam at our kitchen table. When either of them was sick, I made soup and left the bowl outside the bedroom door because they did not always want to talk. Richard used to say I had brought peace to a house that had forgotten how to be a family. I believed him. The estate was on 12 acres outside Briar Glen. The main house was an old stone property with a wide porch, a library, an orchard, and a small guest cottage near the pond. People called it the Vale Estate because Richard's grandfather had built the original house there. But the name was never the same thing as the ownership. That distinction became important many years later. When Richard and I married, the house was in trouble. His grandfather had left it to Richard's father, and Richard's father had left it to Richard with a complicated collection of unpaid obligations attached to the property. The roof needed replacing. The orchard had stopped producing. The taxes were behind. The guest cottage had water damage, and the main house needed work in almost every room. Richard wanted to keep the property because it was the last place where his family had gathered before everything began to fall apart. But wanting something and being able to save it are not the same. At the time, I owned a small architecture and renovation business. It was not glamorous, but it was profitable. I had spent 15 years building it from the ground up, starting with kitchen drawings and small restoration projects. I used my company's savings to purchase the outstanding obligations attached to the property. Then I created a separate family holding company, bought the estate through that company, and placed a long-term right of residence in Richard's name. The arrangement was not romantic. It was practical. Richard could remain in the house and manage the family's use of the property. I would carry the financial responsibility and oversee the restoration. We signed everything properly, paid the taxes, and kept the records in a locked cabinet in my office. Richard understood exactly what we had done. Clara and Jonathan did not. They heard their father say, "The estate stays in the family," and assumed that meant the estate would belong to them one day. I never corrected them because the property was not a prize I wanted them fighting over while Richard was alive. I thought there would be time to explain.
There was always supposed to be time.
Richard became ill in the winter of his 70th year. At first, he was still himself. He argued with doctors, complained about hospital food, and insisted that the orchard would recover in the spring. Then his strength began to disappear. I became his caregiver. I managed medication, appointments, insurance calls, and the endless forms that seemed to multiply every time we entered a new office. Clara visited twice that winter. Jonathan came once, bringing a bottle of wine Richard could no longer drink. I did not keep score. I told myself everyone had their own way of handling grief. 3 days before Richard died, he asked me to bring the locked cabinet from my office to the bedroom. His hands were thin, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do not let them turn this place into a battle," he said. "I won't. They will think I left it to them. I know. Make them read everything." I promised him I would. Richard died early on a Sunday morning while sunlight was coming through the library windows. For the first few hours, there was no family drama. There was only silence, phone calls, and the terrible practical work of informing people that someone they loved was gone. Clara arrived by noon. Jonathan came less than an hour later. They hugged me at the door. They cried in the hallway. They sat beside their father's bed and held his hands. For one evening, we were simply a family that had lost someone. The next morning, the questions began. Clara asked when the lawyer was coming. Jonathan asked whether Richard had updated the will. I told them the estate lawyer would explain everything after the funeral. Clara looked at me carefully. Of course, she said. We just need to know what Dad wanted. I heard the word wanted, but I understood what she meant. What did we get? The funeral was held on Wednesday. Afterward, people returned to the estate for coffee. Richard's cousins filled the library. Neighbors brought food. The house was full of voices that made his absence feel even larger. I stood near the window while Clara and Jonathan spoke quietly at the dining table. They did not know I could hear them. The guest cottage should be mine, Jonathan said. I put money into the plumbing. You stayed there for 4 months, Clara replied. That does not make it yours. I want the black sedan. You cannot take the library paintings. Clara opened a notebook.
She had written down a list.
Main house, guest cottage, orchard lease, vehicles, artwork. They were dividing a life that had not even finished being mourned. I walked into the dining room. Clara closed the notebook. Margaret, she said, we are just trying to make sure Dad's wishes are respected. His wishes will be respected. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. That is not always simple when someone outside the family controls the process. I looked at him. Outside the family? He glanced at Clara. She gave him a warning look, but the words were already in the room. You were Dad's wife, she said. That does not mean you should take everything that belongs to his children. I felt the sentence land inside me with surprising precision. Not because I believed it, because I had spent 32 years making sure they never felt like outsiders in the home I had paid to preserve. And they had reduced me to a person who might steal from them before the funeral flowers were gone. I did not argue. I simply said, the lawyer will be here tomorrow. That night, I went into Richard's library alone. The house was dark except for the lamp beside his chair. His reading glasses were still on the table. A book was open to the same page he had been reading during his last week. I opened the locked cabinet. Inside were the original purchase agreement, the holding company records, the right of residence document, the tax statements, and the deed. My name was on every document that mattered, not because I had hidden anything, because I had been the person who saved the estate when no one else wanted the responsibility. I placed the documents in a leather folder and carried them upstairs. The next morning, the estate lawyer arrived at 9:30. His name was Thomas Avery. He had worked with Richard and me for more than a decade. Clara and Jonathan were already seated at the dining table. They had dressed as if they were attending a business meeting. Clara wore a navy suit. Jonathan had brought a calculator and a stack of printed pages. I sat at the end of the table. Thomas placed a sealed envelope in front of him. Before we read the will, he said, I need everyone to understand the distinction between Mr. Vale's personal estate and the assets held by Vale Heritage Properties. Jonathan frowned. What does that mean? Thomas looked at me briefly, then opened his folder. Vale Heritage Properties owns the Briar Glen estate, including the main house, the guest cottage, the orchard, and the surrounding land. Clara turned toward me. Why are you looking at Margaret? Thomas continued. The company was established by Margaret Vale and funded through her architecture business. Richard Vale held a lifetime right of residence and served as property manager, but he did not personally own the real estate. Jonathan pushed his chair back. That cannot be right. Thomas placed the deed on the table. It is recorded. Clara looked at me. You told Dad the estate would stay in the family. It is still in the family, I said. But family does not mean whoever speaks first at a dining table. Jonathan stood up. You are saying Dad owned nothing? I am saying the estate was not his personal property to leave in a will. Thomas opened the sealed envelope. Mr. Vale's will distributes his personal accounts, vehicles, personal items, and remaining investments. It does not transfer ownership of property held by Vale Heritage Properties. Clara's face had gone pale. She looked down at the notebook where she had divided the rooms and vehicles. The list suddenly looked childish. I was his daughter, she whispered. Yes, I said. And I was his wife. That does not make you the owner.
No.
The deed does. The room became silent. Thomas handed me a second document. It was a letter Richard had written during the final week of his life. He had not left it in the will because it was not an instruction about property. It was a personal letter to Clara and Jonathan. I read it aloud. My children, if you are reading this, you are probably angry that the Briar Glen estate is not being divided between you. I understand why you feel that way. You grew up believing this house belonged to our family because it carried our name. But Margaret saved this property when I could not. She paid the debts, organized the restoration, and carried the responsibility while I was busy pretending history was enough. I asked her to keep the estate because she understands what it costs to preserve something. Do not mistake inheritance for entitlement. If you want a place here, earn it through care, not demands. Your father. I lowered the letter. Clara was crying quietly. Jonathan stared at the deed. For years, I had imagined this moment as a dramatic victory. I had pictured myself standing while they apologized. I had imagined telling them that they had never deserved a single brick. But when it finally happened, I felt mostly tired. A legal document could prove ownership. It could not repair the way they had looked at me when they called me an outsider. Clara finally spoke. Are you going to sell it?
No.
Are you going to make us leave? You do not live here. Jonathan's mouth tightened. You know what we mean. I did know. They were asking whether they still had a place in the family. I closed the folder. The estate will remain open to the family, I said, but it will not be divided as a reward for being born into it. Clara wiped her eyes. What does that mean? It means the guest cottage will become a residence for visiting relatives and caretakers. It means the orchard will continue under a community lease. It means the library will be restored and open for local students on weekends. Jonathan laughed bitterly. You are turning Dad's estate into a charity.
No.
I am turning it into something useful. And what do we get? I looked at him. You get the personal property listed in your father's will. You get the photographs you requested. You get the memories you were willing to protect. Clara lowered her head. For the first time, she looked at the estate not as a pile of assets, but as a place full of work they had never seen. The next few weeks were not easy. Jonathan challenged every decision. He sent messages about the orchard, the guest cottage, and the paintings. He insisted that our father had intended to leave everything to his children. Thomas answered each message with the same calm explanation. The ownership had been recorded for years. Clara became quieter. One afternoon, I found her in the library holding the old family photograph from Richard's first wedding. She had been 16 in the picture, standing beside her father with one hand gripping his sleeve. I thought you were going to take everything, she said. I know. I thought Dad had finally chosen us. I sat across from her. Your father did choose you. He chose you every day. But choosing you did not mean erasing me. She looked at the photograph. Why did you never tell us the estate was yours? Because I did not want you measuring your relationship with your father by what you might inherit. She gave a small, broken laugh. That sounds noble. It was not always noble. Sometimes I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop loving the place. Clara looked at me. Did you think we loved the house? I thought you loved what it represented.
She sat there for a long time.
Then she asked if she could volunteer in the library when it opened. I said yes. Jonathan did not apologize immediately. He needed longer. He had built his identity around the belief that one day the estate would rescue him from his own decisions. But after the orchard lease began, he started helping the manager on weekends. He learned that an orchard was not passive wealth. Trees needed pruning. Equipment broke. Weather ruined entire harvests. One evening, he came to my office covered in dust. I understand now, he said. What do you understand? That Dad did not leave me the estate because Dad did not own the estate. I nodded. And you did. I do.
He looked down.
I treated you like you were waiting to steal something. Yes. I am sorry. It was not a perfect apology. It did not erase what he had said at the dining table, but it was honest. I accepted it without pretending the trust returned in one afternoon. A year after Richard's death, the Briar Glen Library opened on the first Saturday of autumn. Children from the surrounding towns came to read. The orchard produced enough fruit to support the community lease. The guest cottage was repaired and used by visiting teachers and relatives. Clara ran the reading program. Jonathan managed the orchard schedule. Neither of them owned the estate, but both of them finally understood what it meant to belong there. I kept the deed in the same leather folder where Richard had asked me to place it. Not because I enjoyed having power over my stepchildren. Because every time I opened it, I remembered the years when the estate had been nothing but debts, broken roofs, and a family arguing about history. Ownership was not the most important thing I had protected. The real thing I protected was the purpose of the place. My stepchildren thought they had excluded me from their father's legacy. They forgot that a legacy is not the same as a list of possessions. They forgot that the person who preserves a family's history may be more important than the person who carries its name. And they forgot one final detail. Before they divided the estate, they should have read the deed.